Mystery of King's Bench Walk by British Skottowe. Published in the Belgravian magazine of 1890. A barrister without chambers in one of the Inns of Court is, briefly speaking, a forensic suicide. The formation of a business connection and practice at the bar is almost as much dependent on the possession of chambers as the attainment of the dignity of the wig and gown itself is on the eating of dinners. A barrister who received his clients in a three-pair back in some narrow street off the Strand would not be likely to command the confidence of moneyed persons. A barrister who made appointments in the coffee rooms of public houses in the same locality could not reasonably expect to be the hope and stay of injured or indignant ladies. The most shining light of the bar, moreover, would suffer under an imputation of idle frivolity and useless ostentation if, instead of the classic shades of the Inns of Court, he preferred the gilded apartments of the new monster hotels on the Embankment as his place of consultation. So much seemed obvious to the meanest capacity. When, therefore, I had successfully grappled with the bar exam and emerged, technically at least, from the state of pupillage, I decided that the first and most important step in my career at the bar must be the acquisition of a tenancy of chambers in the Temple. Hitherto I had but a slight acquaintance with the Temple, for though I was actually a member of the inner division of that worshipful society, and had in due course consumed under the eye of the benchers in the hall the exact number of dinners which are supposed to form a firm and suitable foundation for a legal education, I had always read in chambers with a well-known man in Gray's Inn, and in consequence only came within the precincts of my own alma mater on very rare occasions. Beyond, therefore, a general knowledge of its geography and a more intimate acquaintance with one or two sets of rooms which were tenanted by friends of mine, I knew very little more about this ancient structure than an inquiring American tourist might casually pick up in a very short time with the help of a porter and a guidebook. I was, therefore, quite unprepared to find that it was by no means so easy to obtain good residential chambers within the bounds of the Temple as I had imagined. If I had merely wanted a small room as an office, with the privilege of putting my name under that of my landlord on the outer door of the set, my wishes could have been easily satisfied, for quite a dozen full-blown barristers of eminence would have been willing to gratify them with alacrity. Complete sets, however, were few and far between, and those which were vacant proved to be either the dingiest of attics hidden away in the roof, or so limited in dimensions that they seemed to me only fit for store closets. I rejected them all in turn, and had almost decided to give up the idea of residing in the Temple for the present, and to content myself with an office until a better opportunity offered, when my informant added, apparently quite as an afterthought, "There's number 14 King's Bench Walk, you know. Would you care for that?" He spoke so doubtfully that I answered testily, "If it is another of those wretched attics, you may save yourself the trouble. That sort of thing won't do." "I don't mean the attics. They are taken. I mean the first floor right." Now, it was so obvious that he had altered the last words of the sentence by an afterthought that I scrutinized him inquiringly in the hope of arriving at his motive. It seemed to me that he had also scrutinized me inquiringly, nay, expectantly. I disappointed his expectation, whatever it was, by remaining silent. "First floor right, number 14, King's Bench Walk, you know." he repeated in an expressionless voice that was annoying to my curiosity. As a matter of fact, I know nothing at all about it, I returned, except that if the rooms are a decent size, the first floor will probably suit me. But if they are not, you can save yourself and me the trouble of going over them. Oh, Lord love you, said the man, apparently surprised out of his reserve. It seemed to me that he must have formed a secret conviction that I really did not want rooms, was only playing at taking them, in fact. They are large enough. It isn't that. He stopped abruptly. What is it, then? I demanded, much mystified. Nothing, he replied with suspicious glibness. Only they haven't been let for some little time and are consequently a little out of repair. However, that's easily remedied, and the rent will be lower, of course, in consideration. Nothing to do with drains, I suggested nervously. Drains were the one point on which I was vulnerable, and it seemed to me highly probable that drainage would be bad in the temple, because if so, you are aware— Oh dear, no, he replied eagerly. Besides, he added, the benchers will put the place in thorough repair for you, and you can have the drains inspected by the sanitary inspector, if you like to pay his fee. That sounded fair enough. Yet I could have sworn from the man's manner that there was some decided drawback to these rooms. What it was I could not divine, and it was quite obvious that he would not tell me. The best course, therefore, was to first inspect them superficially myself, and then have them carefully examined by an expert. I suggested this view. Of course, he agreed. That's the right way. You ought to see them, but not this evening, not in the dark. It was then about 5 o'clock, but darkness had already closed in on us, as is its habit in the London winter. Still, it was really quite early. Give the rooms a chance, he continued earnestly. In this light, you will be fancying that they are worse than they are, or maybe better than they are. Call again tomorrow morning and see them in daylight, sir. Then you can form a really fair view. Besides, he added, seeing that I looked dissatisfied, office hours are over today, and I want to get home. More than ever convinced that there was some decided defect which he merely wanted time to cover over, I yielded to the inevitable and made an appointment for the next morning. It must be confessed that when the rooms were actually exhibited to me, I felt very much inclined to laugh out loud at Mr. Hadgrave's folly and my own. Hadgrave was the official's name. The rooms were really very fine rooms, comprising a set of 4 good chambers, a passage and a box-like arrangement at the end, which was intended as an office for a clerk. The big front room, which looked out onto the walk, was quite a large apartment, as rooms in the temple go, and was panelled throughout in a very flat, ugly style, with heavy black oak. A more dark, dingy, cold, cheerless, nay, positively forbidding abode, however, I had never seen before outside the Tower of London. The chill was so great on entering that I felt a cold shiver stealing convulsively down my spine. But this was not to be wondered at. The rooms had been unlet for a long time, so Mr. Hadgrave had admitted. For a corresponding period, therefore, they had not been warmed by fire or light of any kind, and it was only natural that in the absence of their hated enemies the cold and damp should have entered in and settled down there in grim companionship. The windows, moreover, were grimy with accumulated dirt, which almost excluded the wholesome light of the sun. They had evidently not been subjected to any process of cleansing for ages, and their dingy condition was quite enough in itself to account for the gloom in which the room was enveloped. The dusky hue of the panelled walls added to the sombre effect, which was completed by the absence of any relief in the shape of furniture, with the exception of 2 heavy old oak presses, which might easily have been mistaken for sarcophagi, and some equally heavy shelves fixed into a depression in the wall. A vast chimney-piece of antique style that would not have done discredit to an old Scotch castle completed the tout ensemble, which was dreary and desolate in the extreme. I took in the requirements of the situation at a glance, and with a general's eye rapidly sketched out my plan of campaign. Soap and water, vigorously applied to those grimy windows, would work a miracle by itself in the appearance of the room. A roaring fire burning in the grate would soon dispel the influence of the frost and fog demons which now pervaded the atmosphere. A Turkey carpet stretched over the bare boards, a cart's load of furniture, old oak as far as possible to match the panelling, scattered judiciously about, a portiere disposed gracefully over the door, curtains to match arranged about the windows, a few brass sconces, brackets and shields stuck about in crafty positions, and a good picture or 2 set against the panelling. A radical reform of this character would effect wonders and transform this scene of gloom and desolation into a comfortable 19th century sitting room, flavoured with a most delightful whiff of antiquity. I communicated my views to Mr. Hadgrave, but he did not enter into my raptures at all. If his behaviour had been singular before, it was perfectly phenomenal now. He seemed to take a malign and exceedingly unprofessional pleasure in damping my ardour and drawing my attention to unimportant defects. He pointed out that the panelling was probably rotten at the back and might prove unhealthy, and that it was sure to be full of blackbeetles and rats, which might make uncanny noises at night. He suggested that these big chimneys really gave out very little heat and admitted a great deal of draught, and that what I ought to do would be to put in one of the new Oxford fireplaces which gave out so much warmth, and which would, of course, have clashed most hideously with the general effect of antiquity which I was so anxious to preserve. He wound up by saying that if I would take his advice, I should pull down all that rotten panelling, have up the boards, scrub and wash the entire room, floor, walls and ceiling, fit it up again with a bright wallpaper, pretty furniture and a modern grate, and then it would be fit to live in. He was evidently a vandal of the first order, so I did not argue the point. I merely smiled and said I thought I preferred my own scheme. He replied civilly, "Very well, sir. Of course you know your own mind best." In spite of my entêtement, something quite indefinable in his manner affected me so much that I exclaimed, "I wonder what on earth it is you are hiding from me. Do you know of any positive reason why I should not take the rooms?" He bristled up a little at this and replied stiffly, "No, sir, I do not know of any positive reason why you should not take the rooms." I came to a quick determination. "I will make inquiries," I said. "I have friends in the Temple. I will consult them. If I am satisfied with the result, I will take the rooms." He inclined his head with an air of gentle resignation. However, my evil fortune willed it that Wilson, who had lived several years in Pump Court and so was quite an old inhabitant, was out of town, and thus my principal hope was frustrated. Jack Bulteel, whom I called on next, and by a miracle found in his chambers, was one of those people who are endowed with such high spirits that it is utterly impossible for them to consider anything seriously. When you wish to be amused, their flow of conversation is charming, but when you are in a serious mood they drive you to distraction. Jack, moreover, was one of those so-called barristers who have no practice and never make any effort to obtain any, and who keep rooms in the Temple simply as a reason for coming there as seldom as possible. So far, that is, as their conduct can be said to be guided by any definite motive at all. Jack, moreover, was in his least rational mood. He had just come back from the country. He was off again in 2 days and was in the highest spirits. He evidently knew very little about the Temple, and beyond the fact that there was a King's Bench walk on the other side, he was in the garden court. He had never heard anything with regard to the locality in which my chambers, I had already begun to think of them as mine, were situated. This, however, did not prevent his indulging in a dozen grotesque suggestions, even more preposterous than the last, which were all evidently discharged on the inspiration of the moment from a too fertile imagination. He was especially prolific with ghostly possibilities, and offered to me in turns as possible bogies for the vacant set the spectres of the wicked Templar in Ivanhoe, of a judge who had wilfully hanged the wrong man, a briefless barrister who had blown his brains out in despair, and a laundress who had murdered her tenant in order to steal his tea and whisky. I should probably have gone away in an exceedingly bad temper with him, but that, just as my patience was exhausted, a more practical suggestion struck him, prompted, I fancy, by the least practical of those which had preceded. "Why not consult the present laundress?" he said. "She ought to be able to give you all the information there is to give, and a good deal more." The idea seemed a good one. We adjourned, therefore, in search of the laundress of number 14, King's Bench Walk. We found her in her own den at the foot of the stairs. She proved to be a grimy and rather grumpy female with a hoarse voice and an aggressive manner. She was, apparently, in a bad temper, and was also labouring under a delusion that we were robbers or spies in disguise. Instead of replying to our questions, she insisted on knowing in what way the rooms concerned us. Even the administration of a tip did not mollify her or induce her to talk. Nor was it till I incautiously admitted that I had some intention of taking the rooms myself that her tongue was loosened. Then she broke out in unqualified praise of the rooms, and roundly asserted that old Hadgrave had a spite against her and so wouldn't let them, solely with the view of annoying her. I am afraid that if it had occurred to me at the time that Mrs. Hopkins had a much more tangible interest in inducing me to take the rooms and thereby securing the additional fees that Mr. Hadgrave could possibly have in spiting her, I should not perhaps have attached so much weight to her harangue. As it was, however, it satisfied me completely and decided me to follow out the course of action which my own inclination had already prompted. In short, I returned again to Mr. Hadgrave's office, and when I emerged from it, I was the legal tenant of the first floor right in number 14 King's Bench Walk, in the Inner Temple. A fortnight's judicious labour produced a marvellous change in the appearance of the rooms, and transformed them not merely into a habitable dwelling, but a very comfortable one. The two big outer chambers were fitted up respectively as a drawing-room and library, the latter being chiefly designed to impress prospective clients, while the two inner ones, which opened one out of the other with an approach from the library, were to be bedroom and snuggery. I had a presentiment that the big drawing-room would prove very difficult to warm thoroughly, and I thought the snuggery would prove a comfortable den in frosty weather. I must add that the oak panelling, which I was so proud of, did not extend beyond the two outer rooms, and I arranged the snuggery therefore as an oriental smoking room, placed Indian mats on the walls, strewed Persian rugs on the floor, and fitted in divans and inlaid tables wherever there seemed to be a place for them. Even at this moment, with my vision cleared by experience, I cannot see that during the whole period of preparation the faintest note of warning was given to me. It is true that I was at the temple only during the day, and that I foolishly omitted to make any further inquiries. I remember that one day, as I was bidding the laundress pile up the coals well on the fire before she left for the night, in the hope of driving out some of the damp and intolerable chill which seemed still to pervade the big room, she replied almost insolently, "'Tain't a bit of use, sir." "What do you mean?" I said, exceedingly angry, for I fancied I had detected a tendency to covert insolence on her part before I was determined to put an end to it at once. She saw her mistake, and assuming her most fawning manner, assured me that all she meant was that fires never burnt long when left to themselves. I also remember that as I was directing one of the workmen how to place the pictures on the walls of the big room, he suddenly turned to me and remarked, as it seemed to me apropos de rien, "You bain't a nervous gent at all, be you, sir?" "No," I replied. "I should say not." Then, suspecting some covert allusion, I added, "But why do you ask?" "It strikes me, sir," he answered with a very grave air, "that this here ramshackle old temple must be a lonesome place to be shut up all alone at night, and this here part ain't none the least lonesome." "Oh, I'm not afraid," I said, laughing, and then noticing the exceedingly earnest gaze which he had fixed on me, I became suddenly grave as well. After all, I thought, he may be speaking for conversation's sake, or there may be some more definite idea in his mind. It is impossible to say what. I continued, therefore, deliberately, "I am a very light sleeper, and I always have a loaded revolver quite close to me at night. Besides, I have been the champion heavyweight at Jim the Slogger's boxing school for the last 2 years, so I am not likely to be nervous about burglars, if that's what you mean." He contemplated me with a ruminating, uncertain air, and then, uttering a short laugh, resumed his work, with the trite observation, "Well, sir, you know your own mind best, in course." It seemed to me, however, to be absolutely meaningless. In spite of the naturally dilatory habits of the British working man, the furnishing operations were accomplished at last, and I became the occupant as well as the tenant of the renovated rooms. I was just going to shut my outer door on the world for the first time, when the door opposite opened suddenly, and a jaunty little man came out. He stopped short at the sight of me, stared at me curiously, and then raised his hat politely. "You are the new tenant, I presume?" I assented. "I admire your enterprise," he continued, "and should be proud of your acquaintance. We are neighbours, and we ought to be friends." In brief, this little man's jaunty manner took my fancy, and we speedily became friends. He invited me into his rooms, and later we adjourned to mine. "You like them?" he inquired when I had shown him round my new domain. "Yes." "Find them quite comfortable?" "They ought to be. If not, it's easily remedied." "Ah, don't find them at all cold or dark in the evening?" he suggested with a sly look. "The big room is cold, certainly. I don't expect that I shall use it much in winter. As for its being dark in the evening, I should say that was chiefly a question of lamps, but I haven't spent an evening here yet, as it happens." "Ah," he observed, looking at me with extraordinary gravity, as though pondering some weighty problem. "Yes, exactly. Of course you—" he began abruptly, and then as abruptly stopped. I gazed at him stupidly. "You were going to say?" I suggested. "Nothing," he continued with some slight confusion. "It is no business of mine. That is, I mean that I was going to ask you if you were a stranger here, for I don't know your face. But of course you have friends in the temple." "Yes, exactly, of course. You will forgive my curiosity, I am sure." He seemed quite relieved to find that I had friends in the temple, evidently a most philanthropic person. Or possibly, as the attributes are very indistinctly separated, only a very eccentric or inquisitive one. He was much pleased with my brand new law library, but suggested that I ought to get a few dusty old tomes at some second-hand shop, which would fill in the lower shelves very effectively and impart an air of graceful antiquity and profound erudition to the whole, which could not fail to produce a most salutary impression on my clients. "When they come," I added. "Oh, they'll come, never fear." We passed into the big room, and it was borne in upon me more decidedly than before that it would be very difficult to warm it thoroughly. A big fire had been blazing there intermittently for a week, and yet it had made but a slight impression on the damp chill which pervaded the atmosphere. The fire, moreover, did not prosper in the huge draughty fireplace, and it was evident that the pleasure of preserving this picturesque piece of antiquity would have to be purchased at the expense of a certain amount of discomfort. "Cold, isn't it?" said my companion, glancing at me under his eyebrows. He shivered slightly as he spoke. "Very cold," I assented. "I expect that I shall be obliged to import a gas stove." He shrugged his shoulders and went out. On the common landing, he turned and said to me with great gravity, "Of course, you are the best judge of your own affairs, but I wouldn't live in a place like that if I was paid to do it. That big room is enough to give one the shivers of itself." I smiled confidently in reply. "It will be very different in a week or two." "Well, well," he returned, "I suppose it is bad taste to talk of the gallows in a family of a man who has been hanged." I laughed feebly at this weak and not very apropos joke. "I must be off home," he continued, drawing on his gloves. "Don't you live here?" "No," most emphatically. "No, I am only here in the day." At the end of my first week's residence, the conclusions I arrived at were threefold. First, that the big room would never be really a comfortable apartment in winter. Secondly, that living alone in the temple had a tendency to make one unaccountably nervous and imaginative at night. And thirdly, that a private servant, who would be on the premises at all hours, was becoming an absolute necessity, if only to keep the fires in when I went out in the evening. It was, in fact, very annoying to come home, perhaps nearly frozen, about 11 or 12 o'clock at night, and find the fire completely out, the embers black in the grate, and the atmosphere of frost and fog pervading the room precisely as if the windows had been thrown open to the night's air for hours. Even if I succeeded in relighting the fire and coaxing some semblance of a cheery blaze back into the grate, experience proved that it took a long time to produce any appreciable impression on the damp chill with which the atmosphere of the room was completely saturated. It dawned on me one night, to my intense disgust, that I was growing nervous, and that my nervousness was assuming a form which is only excusable in a hysterical woman or a frightened child. On this particular evening I dined in the hall, and instead of going out afterwards, as was my usual custom, returned to my chambers with the intention of devoting the evening to study. The fire was laid in the big room, but not in the snuggery, a piece of unwarrantable carelessness on the part of Mrs. Hopkins. However, I felt that it would be an excellent opportunity to give the big room the benefit of a blaze of sustained strength and duration. There was an ample supply of illuminating power when my preparations were complete, for I lighted 3 lamps in different parts of the room in order to increase the volume of heat. I took down Tompkins on trusts, a very solid legal authority which I considered it advisable from a professional point of view to acquire an intimate acquaintance with, and which, with this object, I intended to devote the evening to mugging up. There was nothing romantic about Tompkins' subject or imaginative about his style. Both were as dull and prosaic as law itself. There was about as much food for the fancy in his solid pages as might be furnished by a gas pipe or the butt end of a stonebreaker's hammer. And yet, by the time I had toiled through 6 pages, I became aware that the subject had altogether escaped my grasp, and that my brain, instead of pondering on legal axioms and subtleties, was giving way to the most fantastic illusions that ever troubled a monomaniac. I was continually oppressed with the feeling that out of the corners of my eyes, as it were, I could see a vague, shadowy form bending over my shoulder and standing between me and the light. Again and again I started suddenly round in my chair, so vivid was the illusion, only, however, to find that my imagination must have played me a trick, and to vent my denunciations on my folly, which allowed me to be thus victimised. But as often as I turned my attention once more to Tompkins, and endeavoured to absorb myself in the relations between trustee and Skottowe trust, I became once more aware of that shadowy phantom at my shoulder, while the room all around seemed to sink slowly into a sombre gloom until the very page before me appeared blurred and indistinct. Of course, the meaning of this, I mentally determined when, for the 10th time or so, I had convinced myself that there was nothing unusual behind me, and that the lamps were burning just as brilliantly as ever, is that I am going to sleep, and that if it wasn't for this waking nightmare, which stirs me up every now and then, I should doze off over Tompkins and sleep away the greater part of the evening. This will never do. It is evidently too soon after dinner to attempt to read. I had better go out. I took my own advice with the utmost docility. There was a very popular ballet performing at a well-known house of entertainment. I went in for an hour or so, and afterwards looked in at a club. When I returned home, I found the fire out, a polar climate pervading the room, and the wood-bin empty. Exceedingly angry, I invoked maledictions on Mrs. Hopkins's forgetful memory, and resolved to get a servant of my own as soon as possible. I passed an exceedingly disagreeable night, in which the illusion of the evening was repeated with a grotesque extra vengeance peculiar to nightmare. I dreamt that I was pursued by an enormous shadowy figure which I could not see, but which I knew was following me with evil intention. I fled through miles and miles of the gloomiest caverns with the greatest velocity, and with a dreadful feeling that if I stopped for a moment, the pursuer would overtake me. How long the nightmare lasted I am unable to say, but when I awoke at last, I was covered with cold drops, and it was broad day. I saw my neighbour in the afternoon. He had been in the courts and was returning to deposit his wig and gown. We talked a little about a case of great interest in which he was retained, and then at last he said, quite abruptly, with a peculiar look, "You know what I am dying to ask you." "Indeed I do not," I replied in astonishment, both at the question and his manner. "Well then, hang it all, have you seen anything?" "Seen anything?" "Yes." "I don't quite comprehend," I replied, with an uneasy speculation whether my neighbour was liable to fits of mental derangement. He glanced at me incredulously. I mean the shadow, you know? I'm afraid I don't know. What shadow? Don't you know the story of your rooms? Words cannot express the accent of astonishment with which he put this question. No, except that they have been unoccupied for a long time. What a ghastly swindle! Do you mean to say that you were not told that the rooms are supposed to be haunted? Haunted? My dear sir, pray forgive me, but... And I broke into uncontrollable laughter. Don't mention it, he said, not in the least offended. I am glad to hear that it is all nonsense. And what are the rooms supposed to be haunted by? I inquired. Oh, there are all sorts of stories. The principal one is a vague yarn about a sort of shadow or darkness which can be felt, don't you know, and puts out all the lights and fires in the most inconsiderate way. Why, great Scott, man, he cried with a sudden alteration of voice and demeanour. What's the matter? I believe you have seen it after all. Involuntarily there had flashed into my brain the memory of the strange fantasy which had beset me on the preceding evening, and close on its heels came the reflection that there really was an extraordinary difficulty in keeping the fires alight. I communicated my experiences to my companion. Strange, he observed. Yes, that is much the usual story. And they always turn round in time. But the really creepy idea is to think what might happen if they did not turn round. He had sunk his voice to a thrilling whisper which was suggestive of an infinity of horror. An eerie feeling stole over me, and an icy hand seemed to clutch my spine. Then my manhood reasserted itself. Probably they would have gone to sleep, I said lightly. I don't know, he answered gravely, but I should be sorry to try the experiment. By this time I was so ashamed of having even momentarily given way to supernatural terrors that I was anxious to reassert myself. I will try the experiment, I said recklessly. What do you mean? I mean that I will spend this evening in the big room, and that if the illusion occurs again, I will give it a chance. I will not turn round until something definite happens. I think you are very foolish, he replied. I wouldn't do it after what you have told me for £100. 9 o'clock that same evening found me seated in my drawing room, fully prepared to carry out my campaign, and inspired with the courage and complete confidence which springs from the absorption of an excellent dinner. The big fire was burning with a nearer approach to a blaze than I had seen as yet within that sombre grate. 3 large lamps were lighted in different parts of the room. Altogether I felt, with a satisfied air as I settled down in the armchair, that it really would require a very powerful illusion to produce the faintest semblance of gloom. I discarded Tomkins, moreover, for this evening, in favour of a 2-shilling novel which I thought would be less provocative of slumber. The story proved to be a little too interesting. I soon became completely absorbed in it, and forgetting all about the object of my vigil, plunged eagerly into the thick of the mystery which formed its chief ingredient. How long my attention was thus enthralled it is impossible to say, but I suddenly sprang back to consciousness in the very middle of the plot and flung myself round in the chair with an inarticulate cry of expectation and surprise. Someone had touched me lightly on the shoulder, yet no human form was visible. I gazed blankly round the room. I even got up from my chair and executed a more searching survey. I don't exactly know what my motive was. It is true that idiot Jack Bulteel was fond of foolish jokes, but still. Then I remembered the story which I had been told in the afternoon, and a faint wave of cold fleeted through my veins at the remembrance. Was it possible that... Nonsense, I cried aloud. Ridiculous! It must have been pure imagination. I drew a chair up to the fire and sat down with my feet on the fender. The inclination to read had passed away. I remained gazing vacantly into the red depths of the grate. Very soon I became conscious that though my feet were toasting, there was a curious sensation of cold attacking the region of the back. I shivered slightly and stirred up the fire, drawing nearer to get the full effect of the blaze. A vague idea made itself faintly visible that the cold was unaccountable, that the walls were falling strangely into shadow, that a light touch on my shoulder. I sprang to my feet with a cry of fury which changed at once to surprise, not unmingled with fear. The room was black before me, black with a vague, floating, shadowy mist through which the lamps shone with the palest radiance, as if the light were stifled and choked by the darkness. Even at that moment, one of them flickered feebly and went out. The rest would soon follow its example. Petrified with amazement, I stood gazing at the strange sight, while the cold drops gathered on my brow. Then a blast of chill, noisome, horrible vapour swept towards me like the foul breath of some dreadful charnel, and sent an icy thrill of horror shuddering through my frame, stiffening the roots of my hair. I retired a step or two, so hastily that my heel struck against the fender. Then the second lamp went out. Darker and darker grew the room, and out of the very mist of the darkness it seemed to my terrified imagination as if a grim, shadowy figure, bearing a faint resemblance to a human form, clothed in long flowing draperies, were growing into visible reality. The third lamp went out suddenly, as if pinched by spectral fingers. Save for the faint glimmer of the dying embers of the fire, the room was in thick darkness. Fear came strongly upon me, and with a wild yell I fled precipitately. Nor did I stop my headlong flight till I found myself out in the clear, frosty air under the stars of the midnight sky. What is the explanation, you will ask, in tones of shrill incredulity? There is none. The rooms had been so long unoccupied that only the legend remained. Its origin was completely lost. I had the rooms dismantled throughout without making any discovery. One of the workmen who took down the panelling said that the backs of some of the boards were studded with ornamental nails, almost as if they had once served as coffin lids, but this was pure conjecture. The rooms are closed and empty, and the shadow once more reigns undisturbed. The thought haunts me at times unanswered. What is done there in the silence, night after night, when men are asleep? It is enough to make the blood run cold to think of it. That was The Mystery of King's Bench Walk by the gloriously named British Constable Skottowe, an obscure story by a very obscure author. Baron Skottowe, a title passed down in the family after an ancestor was created Baron by Louis XVIII, was born in 1857 and gained his MA from New College, Oxford. He studied history and jurisprudence, perhaps why he chose a barrister as the hero of this story. He was a political historian and wrote popular books on parliamentary history, but also, when in his late 20s, wrote a detective story called Sudden Death. It wasn't a success, and thereafter he concentrated on non-fiction, with the occasional foray into short stories for magazines. This is the only supernatural story he wrote, as far as I know. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please remember to click the like button and check out the other obscure and forgotten stories in the audiobook section of my channel. And, as always, thanks for listening.